Hello and welcome to the review for the Beasts of the Mesozoic Ceratopsian series, Torosaurus and Utahceratops. I am so excited to finally be talking about more Wave 3 figures from this line, so let's just get straight into it. First of all, I'm just gonna get the size comparisons out of the way. I figured I would just bring them in at the beginning because it's fun to put small, normal-sized figures in front of these things and appreciate how big they are. Now we're gonna start with the Utahceratops first, because I've already reviewed the Sinoceratops and Pachyrhinosaurus, and they share a lot of the same body parts as this one, so a lot of the stuff, especially to do with sculpt and articulation, is gonna be pretty much the same with the Utah as well. Now let's start with talking about the sculpt of this figure. Of course it is not exactly the same. The head is obviously completely different. The torso piece and the tail are also a bit different as well. Now this particular combination of body parts just suits Utahceratops perfectly. This figure is really, really accurate to the actual skeletal material. This thicker, bulkier torso piece and this stubbier tail just are perfect choices for the animal. Obviously, this series does really well with accuracy in general, but sometimes some little subtleties of proportions or body shape aren't quite on point because they do have to share parts between so many of the figures. But this is one where all of the body parts really fit the animal well. And accuracy-wise, the body, you know, again, it's probably not technically perfect, but when looking at it next to the skeletals, it really captures the overall build and body shape of Utahceratops, and that is great to see. The head sculpt on this one is also gorgeous and very accurate. The overall shape of the snout and beak looks great. I love the way the little hornlets on the jugal bones really flare outwards on this one. Very nice little detail. This one has some very Cosmoceratops-esque brow horns, and they look great. And I also just adore all these little epicetals running along the side of the frill, culminating in these larger hornlets and these little sort of folded over horns at the very top of the frill in that little gap there. I also really like the scalation on the frill. There's something very satisfying about the texture on it. As far as articulation goes, of course this one is very, very similar to the Sino and the Pachyrhinosaurus, with one main difference. The tail is a different piece, but you know, pretty much has the range of motion you would expect. The torso is wider, but it doesn't actually negatively affect the range of motion hardly at all. The torso has plenty of mobility and works basically just as well as the thinner torso on those other figures, so that's great. The only real part of the articulation on this one that is notably different is the head. This one, out of all the figures I have of this body size, easily has the best range of motion going for its head. The head has great side to side. You can get almost a 90-degree turn to either direction, which is awesome. In fact, I think we can get a little further than that. Yeah, there we go. Very, very nice. You can get it to look upwards until the frill hits the back, and it physically can't go any further up. And you also have some fantastic downwards mobility, which is something I love to see because I think it looks really cool to pose these things, you know, more defensively with their heads lowered and ready for combat or just intimidating something. And not all of them have the best range of motion when it comes to really lowering the head. The Pachyrhinosaurus is one in particular that is kind of lacking in that area, but this one is just no complaints. I mean, you can get it looking almost straight down at the ground, and it looks fantastic. One thing I do want to warn you about, though, is that at least on mine, if I leave this figure posed on the shelf with its head really lowered like this, especially really kind of bent down into this sort of angle, the ball joint does kind of get stuck in the neck, and one time I actually popped the head off trying to move it again. So I don't know if they're all like that, but do just beware and be careful. If you ever feel like yours is kind of stuck in this downward position, just make sure to really push the head inwards while moving it back up so that it doesn't pop out. And if it does pop out, it's not a huge deal. I mean, you could just pop it back in and it wasn't too difficult, but it also wasn't too easy as to make it feel like the joint was loosening. Not too big of a deal, just something that I wanted to mention. Oh, and just finishing up articulation, I should also mention the jaw. There's not really anything particularly noteworthy about it. It just works fairly well. It's not the best jaw on the line, but it's nowhere near the worst. It's just a solid articulated jaw. It does its job. Now to talk about my favorite aspect of this figure, which is the coloration and the gorgeous, gorgeous paint work. This figure just looks like a burning sunset with black clouds silhouetted against it or something like that. It just looks like a beautiful painting. These colors are so striking, and I've just loved the the design of this one color-wise since the moment I saw the prototype. Of course, the colors are based on a Gila monster, and they are very well adapted and translated from that, and the changes that were made, especially to the patterning, suit the figure so well. Black on this figure is so well utilized. All the black patterning is so complex and so striking looking, and there are also some areas of simpler patterns that are really well utilized too, like just these simple bands on the tail, obviously taken straight from the color scheme of the lizard that it's based on. Those look great, and it's a great sort of contrast and accent to the busier patterns elsewhere on the body. I really love the black socks, and especially how they contrast with the lighter colored claws on both the hind and forefeet. And I absolutely adore all the black on the face. There's something about color schemes where the animal has a really dark colored head or a dark colored snout. I just adore that. I love, black-headed pythons and taipans and snakes with those sorts of color schemes. As you can imagine, I am super excited for the upcoming Tarbosaurus from the Tyrannosaur series because it is literally based on an inland taipan, which has that sort of coloration with a fully black head. And obviously this isn't as extreme, this is just a lot of black around the snout and the mouth specifically, but it still just looks so striking, and I love that. It's, for whatever reason, it's just one of those sort of design aspects that I always really enjoy seeing. The patterning on the frill also looks very, very nice. It does sort of have two little eye spots here, almost looks like another ceratopsian like looking at you, like two eyes and then kind of a frill up here. I really like that. It also looks very fiery with these sort of little bits of broken up kind of flame pattern around the edge, and that just looks beautiful. I also adore the use of spots on this figure. There's 3 little spots underneath the eye and some little spots on the lower jaw, and just straight up spots or dots or freckles and things, or patterns that I wish we would see more of on figures. I think they can look really, really nice, and I'm really happy to see some of them here. And in fact, both the figures we're talking about today utilize spots very, very well. All of the oranges and reds across this figure's body also just look beautiful and are really well blended. There's some great subtlety between all the different shades of orange and such blending together, from areas of lighter and paler sort of oranges to darker and more saturated areas, culminating in this brilliant, gorgeous red color over the shoulders and of course onto the frill and the whole head area. And one of my favorite little color details on the entire body is just this especially dark, rich looking red over the hips along these little patterns here. It has this slight sort of black wash over it, and I don't know why, but it just looks really, really gorgeous to me. My conclusion for this one, I don't really have too much to say about it. It's black, orange, and red, a color palette I think everyone can get behind. It's a cool genus with a really great looking head. This one is just fantastic. I don't feel like I have to sell it at all. I can't imagine anyone hating this thing. Now the Torosaurus, which I have to grab from way over here, the Torosaurus is just a different beast entirely. My gosh, look at the size of this thing, especially next to the tiny little Zuniceratops. I've never been more happy that I bought the Zuniceratops, because now I have the smallest and largest figures from the Ceratopsian line, and it is very, very fun to look at them together. The initial impact of unboxing this Torosaurus is an experience I will never forget. It's interesting because the longer I've sat with it, it really isn't any bigger than I thought it would be. I mean, there's pictures all over Creative Beast's Instagram and socials showing it next to other Beast of the Mesozoic figures. You can see how big it's gonna be, but just having it in person hits different. You just can't fully prepare yourself for the impact it has in person, especially picking it up and feeling how heavy it is. I'm a lot more used to it now, but just thinking back to first taking it out of the box, unforgettable experience. One of the most impressive and coolest unboxings of a dinosaur figure I've ever done, for sure. Now, in terms of the sculpt on this figure, it is a digitally sculpted figure, just like the Triceratops, and it does essentially have the same body as the subadult trike that I already had. I think some of the texturing is a little different, but visually it's almost the exact same body, just way bigger. And, you know, in my review where I talked about all my my first 8, I think, ceratopsians that I got from the series, in the video where I talk about the subadult trike, I mentioned that it's not my favorite. I think its articulation is pretty stiff and hindered, and, you know, I have some issues with its sculpt from that perspective, a perspective of functionality and how well it moves. Visually, though, I don't know if I mentioned it in that video, but visually, that one has one of the best looking bodies, mainly because it's just so cohesive and seamless and really conceals the joints well, and that 100% carries over to the big trike and Torosaurus as well. This figure just has such a cohesive, nice flow to the shape of its body, and of everything in the line, these ones with this body, I guess also the BionicleSaurus, even though I'm not the biggest fan of that one, the one thing they all have going for them for sure is just how well the joints are hidden, how seamless it all looks, and just the overall nice shape of the body. Even the Utah, which of course I adore, and right now I would probably say is my favorite out of the whole line. Even though it does very well, because everything in this line looks good in terms of the way the parts mesh together, it's not perfect. You know, the flow from the hips to the higher sloping back could look a little smoother. I have no complaints like that for the Toro or trike though. I mean, just the silhouette is so smooth and so seamless, it looks fantastic. The head sculpt on this one is also just one of the most impressive head sculpts in the entire line. I mean, first of all, look at the size of it. It's basically almost the length of the entire Zuniceratops, which is crazy. And accuracy-wise, it's basically a perfect Torosaurus head. I don't really have much to say about it other than that. It's just kind of a perfect Torosaurus head. The only real thing to note is this very extreme covering of keratin over not only the horns, but much of the face and the snout and also the entire frill. I believe there is some potential evidence now that kind of contradicts that. I don't think there's anything conclusive, and certainly back when this figure was originally designed, there was not. So I think it, especially for the time, was a reasonable speculation, and it just looks fantastic and feels really cool as well. It just has this very smooth, but, you know, just subtly textured sort of feel to it, and I love that decision. Even if it's not 100% accurate anymore, I still think, again, especially for the time, reasonable speculation and just a great idea design-wise. Now, in terms of articulation, like I said, the subadult trike, and in fact, it's up here on a shelf right next to me, so I'm gonna grab it. I kind of didn't even think to grab it before starting the video, but here it is. Again, my big complaint with this one is just that the articulation feels a lot stiffer and more hindered than anything else I've gotten from the line, and I've handled, I think, every single figure body size from the line in person, except for the taco. It's still very good, just compared to the others, it feels limited and it's not as fun to mess around with. And I was kind of worried about these big ones because I knew that stability would have to be a priority with how heavy they are, and I didn't expect much mobility from them compared to, you know, some of the other figures in the line. I could not have been more wrong. Somehow, the same body, just, you know, 3D printed and molded larger. I don't know if they used 3D, I assume they used 3D printing since it's a digital sculpt to, you know, initially create the mold. But regardless of the process and whatever details I might be getting wrong, essentially the same body, just bigger, somehow works so much better. We went from like the worst articulated one in the line to potentially the best. The limbs are mostly what you would expect in terms of overall articulation range. The elbows are very stiff and very sturdy, but not too stiff. You can still move them fairly easily. The wrists have plenty of range on them, and they can twist around. They do have a little bit of difficulty twisting around, but they can do it just fine. The legs honestly have remarkable articulation on a number of fronts. First of all, the hips on this one are some of the better hips in the line. Not necessarily the best, but they can splay out quite a lot, as you can see, which is nice. Almost all the figures in the line can do that, but just not super well. But this one, you can really splay out the legs quite wide if you want to, which is really nice to have. The knees on this one, and I'm hoping you can hear this, let me bring it up to the mic. They're actually ratchet joints. I was hoping for ratchet joints with the bigger figures in this series. I'm assuming they'll be on some of the bigger Tyrannosaurs now since they're on the trike and the Toro. Such a great idea. Obviously, it improves stability tremendously. I did not expect that, and it's super cool. And the ankles and the feet on this one also are just some of the smoothest and most mobile feeling ankles and feet out of anything in the series, and that's really, really nice. Even the tail on this one doesn't pop quite as tightly into the torso as a lot of the other smaller ones in this line, so I'd say you even have a little more range on the tail than some of the others. The head is great. The head is one of the worst aspects articulation-wise of the small trike, but on the big Toro and the big trike, and I've handled the big trike in person, their heads have tons of range. You have really good downwards range. If you pull it too far down, it will pop out though. I did that. And it was a little bit unnerving, but thankfully it went right back in. It can go upwards as much as you would want it to. It can't quite get its frill touching its back like the Utah, but it can get close, more than enough range. And the side to side is fantastic. You can almost get the frill hitting the shoulder, which is nuts. It does leave a bit of a gap on this side of the neck, but that's not too big of a deal. It doesn't really hinder my ability to pose it anyway. I never really get too bothered by that. The one area of head articulation that still isn't great is the sort of side-to-side twist. It doesn't really have that much going on there, unfortunately, but it still is a very minor improvement on the small trike. However, easily the best joint on this entire figure is the torso joint, and it's one of the worst on the subadult trike. It's not horrible, it's just not as usable as you'd think it would be. The side to side is barely there. I mean, it gets the job done, I guess, but it's not great. The side to side twist is actually really good. But then the ab crunch, you can crunch it down quite a bit, but then this hip piece just sticks up like that, and it looks really weird, so I never really do that, because it just looks weird. I don't know what else to say, it just doesn't really look right. This figure doesn't have that problem at all. You can crunch it, and I mean, technically there's a little bit of a gap here, it sticks up a little bit, but the joints must just be better aligned or something, because it looks so much more cohesive than the small one. And you can also just crunch the torso down way further. I mean, look at that. The side to side is crazy. Look at that. Look at here, the top view is the best. Look at it go, and just, you can tell the amount of mobility and just freedom you have with this joint is crazy. I am so impressed by the torso joint on this figure. It is the funnest joint to mess with on the entire thing, and of all the figures in the line that I have, just bending the torso one direction or the other easily makes the biggest visual difference on this one in terms of actually posing it on the shelf. And that is really, really cool. The only real articulation-related complaint I have is that much like the small trike, the jaw on this one still isn't great, to be honest. It doesn't really close all the way, and when you close it as much as it can, this little bit kind of sticks out down here, which is unfortunate. That doesn't bug me too much. The bigger problem in my eyes is that when you open it, you get some pretty gnarly gaps back in here that you can see. It's really not the worst. You kind of stop noticing it pretty quickly, but still something to mention. The jaw leaves a bit to be desired, but honestly, it gets the job done, and I've kind of just stopped being bothered by it the longer I've been just messing with this figure over the past month or so. But yeah, that's about it for articulation. Let's move on to the colors. Now, the colors on this figure are ones where I can kind of understand why some people might not be the biggest fan of them. It is very monocolor looking when you just glance at it. It's very blue, but I will say, first of all, in person, it is just darker than I thought it would be. The blue just is not as bright and in your face, and I think it's just a really beautiful shade of blue, especially in hand. And as well, this paint job is so much more gritty and detail-oriented and has way more subtlety going on than you think it does. I think in a lot of the pictures, it looks more monocolor than it is because there's a lot of subtle staining and shading around the figure that really adds to it. I mean, for one, the main shade of blue is not as consistent as you think it is. I mean, I can see just looking at it here in person that, for instance, these blue spots are clearly a slightly darker blue than down here because they have like a little bit of a black sort of staining or wash over them. That's very subtle, but especially because they're surrounded by black, if anything, they should look brighter, but they clearly look darker than this blue, which I think even looks a little bit darker than like some of the blue right along like sort of this center area of the head. It's very subtle. It totally just has to do with like little bits of staining of like darker blacks and things, but it really does add to the figure. It adds just some nice kind of shading to certain areas. We also have some green on this figure. I don't know if you'll be able to see it super well. Oh, you can. This dark splotch right here is a dark forest green, or maybe a little bit more of a moss green. I didn't think this figure was gonna have green on it at all until I saw reviews of it. I mean, maybe you can see that a little bit in some of the images, you know, the promotional images and stuff. You probably can, and maybe I just wasn't looking close enough. But in person, it's very obvious, and it's a great little subtle accent. It's also on the arms as well. They just have a little bit of that darker green staining and a little bit of yellow on them as well. There's more yellow on the underside and under the throat and on the lower jaw. And we also have just some cool little details, like the fact that the osteoderms on the thighs and over the hips, like basically from around here back, are a slightly different shade of blue than the main shade of blue on the body. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but they're just a little bit more of a periwinkle or purpley sort of blue color. I don't feel like the camera's capturing it well, but in person, these little osteoderms, these bigger sort of tubercle scales, are so clearly a different blue. And that's just a really nice subtle detail that I did not expect. I think you can see it pretty clearly on the tail there. We also, over the hips, just have this very nice sort of white dry brushing, which does definitely add a great highlight to sort of the hindquarters of the animal, and we have quite a bit of white on the tip of the tail. There's also a tiny bit of red sort of stained over some of the black areas on this figure, which you can't see it in the pictures hardly at all. I don't even know if I'm gonna be able to capture it very well on camera, but maybe you can see it there on those black splotches on the upper leg, but there is just a little bit of dark sort of maroon red just stained in the cracks between the scales on some of the black patterns on the animal. Super subtle stuff, but it adds a lot. This figure just looks way more weathered and gritty in person than I think I expected it to. And it just looks great. All the subtlety in the paint job is really impressive and really neat. The head also has several great highlights in terms of paintwork and coloration. It has a really nice sort of just darker wash over a lot of the frill and stuff. Again, just adding to that grittier look. Obviously, the war paint around the eyes just looks dope. I mean, it just looks so cool and tribal and striking, and is really a great highlight for the overall palette. Another great highlight that I just love, a little bit of contrast, is just this warmer tan on the beak and the cheeks as well. I don't know what gave David Silva the idea to add that, but it's just the perfect complement to the blue. Like, it contrasts it perfectly. It's so satisfying looking. And of course, it has two humongous eye spots on its frill, which I just adore. Giant eye spots are a staple among paleoart and reconstructions of Torosaurus especially, but ceratopsians in general. And there are other figures in this line that do somewhat have, I mean, this guy actually has two little spots on his frill. And there's a number of figures in the line that sort of have eye spots or eye spot-ish looking patterns, but the Torosaurus is the only one that has extremely obvious, extremely in-your-face eye spots, and they look so cool. I love that there are essentially no other patterns on the frill besides the eye spots. It just really allows them to stand out on this otherwise relatively blank canvas. And, you know, I have already posed this thing all sorts of ways on the shelf, but one of my favorite poses I always come back to is just any pose where I can have its head, you know, facing me where I sit at my desk. Because just looking over at the shelf and seeing that staring at you is just so cool. It has such a presence to it, and I love that so, so much. However, my favorite part of the coloration has to be the black. All the usage of black on this figure is just gorgeous. The transition from this big area of black with blue spots into this big area of blue with black stripes, just the arc and the flow of the patterns on this one. I don't know why, but these are just some of my favorite patterns in the entire line. There is something about the way they flow across the body, all the way down to these simple little stripes down the tail, that I just absolutely adore. The black just adds so much to the overall design and presence of the figure. And again, just some of my favorite patterns in the whole Ceratopsian series. And one detail that I just adore is the fact that this top row of spots here along the back and the neck has these lighter blue little rings in them. I love that. Adding little rings or sort of pinstripes to the insides of spots. We need more of that, because that just looks dope. I love that little detail. And that is about it for the Torosaurus. I don't think there's too much else to say about it. It's just kind of a masterpiece. And I guess my conclusion for this one is simply that if you are someone who, you know, might be vaguely interested in getting the big Triceratops or the big Torosaurus, but maybe you're a little apprehensive, I just cannot recommend them enough. I've seen the trike in hand because my friend Eric brought over his recently and I got to mess around with it. That one is amazing as well. You can't go wrong with either. And yeah, I just can't recommend them enough. I know it's a lot of money, and I know for me the big concern is always space. I know it's a lot of room on the shelf devoted to one big thing. But the impact of this giant, beautiful, just incredibly well-crafted, bright blue ceratopsian on my shelf, nothing else is ever gonna compare to this thing in terms of just that impact and how striking it is. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that's about everything I have to say for this video. Let me just, as long as I have them here, bring back all the size comparisons and stuff real quick. There is everything all together. Thank you so much for watching this video and also my review of the Sinoceratops and my earlier review of, again, I think it was the first 8 ceratopsians that I got from the line. If you haven't seen those videos, then, you know, make sure to check them out. And yeah, I have just absolutely loved talking about these things. And the whole experience, all the way from the hype of the Kickstarter, all the way till now, and having all 3 waves released, it's just been so enjoyable. These figures are incredible. I'll put a link down in the description to where you can buy them, of course. And I think that's everything I have to say. So let me know down in the comments, you know, what your favorite figures from the line are and what your experience with them has been like, and, you know, what you're excited for. I am so excited for both the Tyrannosaur series and for Cyberzoic. Again, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.